In Matthew 5, verse 31 and 32, Jesus said, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." It's really important that we hear Jesus' divorce instructions carefully, and that we hear the spirit of his words, or some people who should not get hurt could get hurt. So let me do a little history lesson for a moment in order to set the social context of those words. In the Hebraic society of the Old Testament, divorce was a common practice, so Moses, the lawgiver, set forth legislative guidelines in an attempt to humanize it. Those are clarified in Deuteronomy chapter 24. But even those guidelines were fiercely debated. In Jesus' era, there was one school of rabbis led by Rabbi Hillel who held that a man could divorce his wife for any reason. For example, if she burned the toast that morning, or if he saw another woman that pleased him more, those were sufficient grounds for divorce for the school of Hillel. Another group led by Rabbi Shammai felt that marital unfaithfulness was the only allowable grounds for a man to divorce his wife. Either way, as you can see, women were the objects of abuse. The Pharisees sought to bring Jesus into this debate, and so one time they asked him, as recorded in Matthew 19:3, some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any and every reason?" The school of Hillel said yes. The school of Shammai said no. So like a presidential candidate in an election debate, people are asking, on which side of the divorce issue does Jesus stand? Who does he side with? And rather than side with one group or the other, Jesus brought them back to God's intention from the very beginning. Matthew 19, starting at verse 4. "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.' So they're no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." God's intent for marriage is to be a permanent one flesh reality. But this raised the issue of the Mosaic legislation. And so the Pharisees ask in Matthew 19:7, well, why then did Moses command one to give his wife a certificate of divorce and to send her away? Now notice Jesus' answer to the question in verse 8. "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning." You see what he's saying? He's talking to men, and he says to those men, Moses allowed divorce in order to protect women from hard-hearted men. It was better for the man to divorce his wife than to abuse her. But divorce was not God's intent from the beginning. Jesus opposed the divorce practices of his day for the exact reason that Moses first instituted a certificate of divorce. What was that reason? To protect the woman, who in that culture was utterly defenseless and trapped by a destructive and evil practice. There was tremendous harm done to women in Jesus' day by divorce, and the word for divorce literally means to throw away. And women could be thrown away by a very simple procedure that did not involve a court of law or even a religious organization. Only two witnesses were involved, and they could both be the husband's witnesses. No legal charges needed to be brought. It was simply a matter of handing the woman a bill of divorce that said she was divorced for certain reasons, and those could be almost anything from speaking out of turn to not feeding the dog. And the man was generally thought to be pretty righteous in the matter if, when he sent his wife away, he gave her the bill of divorce because she at least had a certificate to prove her single status. That way she could remarry. The woman was trapped in this patriarchal world of the first century. Jesus opposed this evil practice of throwing women away, and so in this Matthew 5 passage, he intervenes. And he says that any man who divorces his wife causes her to become an adulteress. What is he saying? A woman who was thrown out into the street had only one way to make a living. She could not go out and get a job somewhere. She had only one thing to sell. And that's why prostitution was tolerated in first century culture. Jesus was not trying to set down a legalistic set of rules to determine, now, when is a divorce allowable? Matthew 5:32 does not mean that adultery is the one and only grounds for divorce, or that adultery should mean divorce in every case. He was not establishing a rule at all. He was striking at the spirit in which people live with each other, which is the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount. You say you have your rules. I say I see your hearts. Don't use the rules to cloak the real intention of your hearts. Some people see only the letter in the scriptures, and they'll like to say that only adultery and desertion mentioned in 1 Corinthians 7 are biblical grounds for divorce. So if a woman is being beaten up, she should just hang in there because she doesn't have a biblical reason to be divorced. Or if a woman is dishonest, manipulative, deceitful, there's no trust, the man should tolerate it even though the marriage is really a sham because she hasn't been unfaithful yet. You see, that's the mentality and the fatal weakness of any attempt to turn the words of Jesus into a new legalism. It leads to what humanity always does with mere law, manipulation. And Christ saw right through the manipulation. He knew we would manipulate around the rules and think we're okay, and they were doing that. Now, if Jesus is not giving a new set of rules, what guidance is he giving? And does the New Testament, what does it say on the question of divorce? Well, you saw that in Matthew 19. The two will become one flesh. Divorce, I've called it the second greatest hurt on earth. It is possible to survive. Many of you are testimonies to that, but it is not just minor outpatient procedure. It is a radical, invasive surgery of the soul without an anesthetic. So this being the case, divorce should always be an absolutely last-ditch solution to every possible means of God's love and grace have been exhausted. Divorce is not something we turn to just because we're having trouble in our marriage or because we've fallen in love with someone else. As author Charles Swindoll once said, two processes should never be entered into prematurely, embalming and divorce. But we live in a fallen world, don't we? And we're imperfect people. And there are times when, despite our best efforts, the marriage enters the valley of the shadow of death. The spirit of the law behind the marriage and divorce teachings of Matthew 5, Matthew 19, and 1 Corinthians 7, I believe, is this. The basis for divorce that conforms to the will of Christ is precisely the same as the basis for marriage. When it is clear that the continuation of the marriage is substantially more destructive than a divorce, then the marriage could end. That's very important, that language that I use there specifically. Now, in order to see the application for us, look at the end of Matthew 5:32, where he says, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. So again, people who want to look at Jesus establishing a new law, look at that and say, well, that brings up remarriage. That means that remarriage is never allowed. No. Again, Jesus was dealing with the aggressiveness of the male dominance in the first century culture. In that day, when a man could drop a woman on a whim, Jesus is condemning the use of the Mosaic law, giving a certificate of divorce, because that makes it legal, right? I'm still within the bounds of legality, by which men could collect and discard women like ranchers buy and sell cattle. And that was literally happening in his day. And so in Matthew 5:31 and 32, Jesus is saying, I see right through what you're doing. I see what you're really doing. You're very religious, and you are using the religious letter of the law to cover up the real conditions of your hearts, and all you're doing is wife swapping. You're using the law to cover the worst of the realities, your loveless, law-abiding hearts. Now, I think there are two applications for us to consider. One, Jesus is condemning manipulating a divorce because you know it's an acceptable move in our culture. He knows when you're taking the easy way out and using the law to do it. Now again, I'll say, the spirit of the Scriptures concerning divorce is the basis for divorce that conforms to the will of Christ is precisely the same as the basis for marriage when it is clear that the continuation of the marriage is substantially more destructive than a divorce, then the marriage could end. And the same thing is true for remarriage. The basis for remarriage that conforms to the will of Christ is precisely the same as the basis for marriage. When it is clear that the persons involved would be substantially better off and the kingdom of God more effectively advanced by remarriage, then the law of love indicates that remarriage can occur. You see, the point is, God knows when we're undermining the relationship out of a loveless heart. Even though from the outside we may be doing it legally. We haven't got a divorce, right? He knows this. He knows if you'll take this teaching that I'm giving right now and use it to your advantage. He knows if you'll take this teaching that I'm giving right today and use it to manipulate getting your way. That's one application. The second one is Jesus is condemning the common practice of being legally married but in reality emotionally divorced and thereby cloaking the truly unloving conditions of our hearts. This is a clear application of the truth from this passage that applies to our church. Put simply, many of us know that it is God's will that two people living together would be in a covenant of marriage. But it is outside of God's will to be living together inside the covenant of marriage, while in reality you're emotionally divorced. Being emotionally divorced while married is missing the mark, possibly as much as living together and not officially in a marital covenant. And the truth is, we can use the external confirmation to the law, you ought to be married if you're living together, to hide the fact that we're not living the law of love. In our hearts, we're really divorced, even though we're legal. Dallas Willard once wrote about a very devout, well-intentioned religious woman whose husband had married her as a cover for his homosexuality. He consummated the marriage so that it could not be annulled, and after that, he had nothing to do with her. They had no personal relationship at all. He would bring his male friends home to be with him, and in her presence, he would have sex with them in the living room or wherever else they pleased. Her religious guides continued to tell her, you must stay in the marriage, while she died a slow, humiliating death every day, year after year. Now, in more general terms than that story, emotional detachment in marriage is as much of a problem in churches like ours, in a culture like ours, as living together outside of marriage really is. And Jesus' point is, those of you living within my kingdom, my rule, people living within the transformation of the Father's love, they don't live this way. They may keep the external laws, but it's because they've gone much deeper to the righteousness that surpasses the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the righteousness of the heart that comes from me and my life in them and my love in them. Divorce is one of the greatest hurts on earth. It is surgery without an anesthetic. So what do? Well, I want to leave you with hope, because Christ offers the hope of renewal. Nobody said it better than Dallas Willard. Hard hearts may make divorce necessary to avoid greater harm, but kingdom hearts are not hard. And they together can find ways to bear with each other, to speak truth in love, to change, often through times of great pain and distress, until the tender intimacy of mutual covenant-framed love finds a way for the two lives to remain one, beautifully and increasingly.